an investigative reporter with ProPublica, propublica.org, the website, and certainly you need to get on their mailing list. Just go over to propublica.org and sign up. It'll pop right up. Noah Pransky, at Noah Pransky, Pransky on Twitter, and of course at ProPublica, or X, or whatever you want to call it these days. Noah, welcome to the program. Tell us about this story. Just blew my mind. I mean, starting out with David Vitter, who of all people, and his wife Wendy as a federal judge. Give us some background here. First, lay out the premise of your story, and give us a couple of examples of how horrible this situation, this out of control situation, has gotten.
So we all have probably by now heard about what's happening at the Supreme Court, but the truth of the matter is, when you look at the laws we live by and the way we live our lives, almost all of those consequential decisions are made at lower courts, either federal or your state courts. And when you have state Supreme Courts, there's really no one that those justices often answer to in almost all 50 states. So a couple years ago, when I saw all of the stuff starting to come out about the Supreme Court, I said, we really need to be looking at all these other courts that tend to get a lot less attention on them. So I actually reached out to my alma mater, Boston University. I teamed up with some student researchers there. And for the last 2 years, we've been going through 1,200 plus judges at all these consequential judiciaries all around the country, again, federal and state level. And what we found is a pattern of systemic failures when it comes to judges recusing themselves, or at least disclosing issues when a family member has a connection to a case. Sometimes it is a direct financial connection, like owning a stock. Sometimes it's indirect, like, oh, the spouse of the judge represents this client in, either court or in public relations. And sometimes there were other connections we discovered as well. And you asked for some examples. Some of the ones we profiled in our story this week. Judge Wendy Vitter, as you mentioned. She's a judge who was appointed back in 2018 to the federal bench out of Louisiana. Her husband, well known to anyone in that state. He's a former U.S. senator. But he moved on after Congress to become a lobbyist. And several times we actually found that clients very close to him would appear in front of Wendy Vitter's court. And we detailed one very specific case, Plaquemines Parish, basically suburb of New Orleans. They were in front of her court, but never disclosed to the parties in the court with the fact that David was lobbying for one of the agencies controlled by this parish. So we detail that in the story. We detail some other cases, including a judge in Minnesota whose wife was doing PR for one of the corporations appearing before him, and a judge in Florida, a state Supreme Court judge in Florida, who was hearing the constitutionality argument of legislation that his wife actually co-wrote.
Wow. So
some very direct, some very concerning examples we highlight, but we did find bigger patterns. This is happening just all too much.
Yeah. What, you said 1,200 judges nationwide. What percentage of them did you find could be condemned for this kind of behavior?
So if you want to look for a silver lining, the majority of judges appear to do the right thing, but it's really hard for us to put a number on this because judges aren't disclosing when there's a potential issue. So the American Bar Association says that a judge should disclose not only a conflict of interest, but anything that might pertain to an apparent conflict of interest, essentially to preserve trust in the judiciary.
Right.
But we found that's not happening. I mean, we found dozens of cases that weren't disclosed. And it raises the question, how many more of them are there out there? Because we asked for lists of recusals. We asked for lists of conflict. And almost every bench across the country, both at the federal and state level, they don't even keep these lists. So it's up to each individual judge to decide whether he or she will recuse and whether he or she will even disclose these connections that their spouse has.
Did you find any correlation between the political affiliation and the willingness to be, I think we can call this corrupt behavior, to engage in corrupt behavior?
It's really
certainly
hard
see it
to
on the
say.
Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's hard to say because so much when you look at state Supreme Courts, you'll find that the party in charge really, the judges at a state Supreme Court tend to correlate with the party in charge in that state or the way that that state may lean at the ballot box. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one party is better than the other. We highlight cases from both parties, and sometimes it really just comes down to, are people paying attention?
Yeah.
Are legislatures holding their judiciary to account? And are the checks and balances for this, really important third branch of our government, are the checks and balances completely broken in that state? And we found in a lot of states they were.
One of the things that I've noticed over the years, and I'm not an attorney, but I can watch television and read the newspapers, and have been inside courtrooms, is that judges have an almost godlike power within their courtrooms, and I'm wondering if there's an arrogance born of that you think might be feeding this kind of behavior.
We talked to more than a dozen really nationally renowned experts on this, and several of them brought that up. Not so much in that the judge is arrogant, but there's just this culture that when you appoint a judge, this really important position, they are presumed to have impeccable decision. But the truth is, humans just aren't great at making all decisions. A lot of humans are really bad at assessing their own bias. Mm-hmm. And we've essentially given judges in this country almost full control of their decisions to sit on a case or recuse. So they're relying on their own bias. And even a lot of these judges, we presume they're actually trying to do the right thing, but they have blind spots. And when there's no check and balance on a judge's bias, and they're not disclosing possible connections so that other people, like attorneys in a case, can also judge, it's just completely breaking down. We saw a lot of creative interpretations of rules for judges to stay on a case. And from an outside bystander, someone like myself or the experts we talked to, these things should have been disclosed. In many cases, recusals were warranted.
So where do we go from here? We're talking, by the way, with Noah Pransky, an investigative reporter with ProPublica.org. There is already federal legislation with regard to ethical behavior of judges, and I'm assuming that that's true in most states. Is it a failure to enforce the law, or even a failure to have anybody who has the responsibility for enforcing these kinds of laws? I mean, what do we do about this?
Yeah, so we basically identified 3 points for 3 breakdowns that can be improved. One is the self-policing of judges. Some states actually do have systems where if there's a potential issue, a judge must immediately hand it over to a set of other judges to help decide. So we could push that state by state, or at the federal judiciary. That would help. Requirements for better transparency and adding teeth to it, actual teeth, so that when a judge doesn't do it, something bad happens, there's actually some discipline. And that leads to the third one, which is accountability and appeals. So when a judge does something wrong, or even in the best intentions makes a bad decision, there needs to be a better process to appeal these decisions and hold a judge accountable or get a case removed from his or her docket. Because right now, even when these things are identified after the fact, all of the stuff in our story, the parties from these old cases have almost no option to appeal, given the way that our rules are written. So the first step here is transparency. After that, the American Bar Association and watchdogs like the Brennan Institute have laid out a way to make our judiciary better. And this doesn't have to be an indictment on the system. This can be a wake-up call to improve the system.
I get it. Last question, Noah. Has anybody from the House or Senate Judiciary Committee, which is where legislation that might enforce this or put teeth into this would have to originate, reached out to you or any of your colleagues?
Not yet, but we're happy to provide them some of the intel we received on this investigation if they should reach out. Yeah,
I would think that Jamie Raskin and Sheldon Whitehouse and Ron Wyden would be very interested in this, and they're probably already on it. But let's hope. Noah Pransky, Noah, you're doing God's work. Thank you so much for dropping by and sharing it with us.
Thank you, Tom.
Good talking to you. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. Donald Trump begging Bobby Kennedy for his endorsement. It's weird. It's getting very weird out there. I'll be right back with you. Stick around.